She worked at Google until she walked out. She left her mark on the net neutrality debate in the US. She founded the AI Now Institute, and she's now the president of the Signal Foundation. She's a friend of the club. Please give a warm welcome. Here's Meredith Whittaker.
Okay. It is perhaps my fault. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Linus. It is truly my nervous system calmed down when I walked in this building, because this is such a better and different tech world than the world I often encounter working in tech for nearly 20 years. So I'm really, really happy to be here, and I'm really happy that this space exists. And because I have a bit of a cold, and because I apologize, I don't speak German, I'm going to get right into my talk, which represents a bit of a divergence for me. It's some research I've been doing kind of in my spare time, looking at how we can create better definitions of privacy that, in pursuit of, will lead to more liberatory ends. So my talk is called Feelings Are Facts, Love, Privacy, and the Politics of Intellectual Shame. I'm going to present it in 5 parts, and then I'll be publishing it after this with citations for anyone who's interested in different facets of this talk. So part 1, why we need to redefine privacy. But before I get into that, why am I talking about emotions, about the subjective, soft-edge stuff at a German hacker conference? Why this when there are bills to push and governments to push back on, and large surveillance companies to scrutinize, and strategies for survival that need attention now, right? Is LOVE an acronym for a new mode of digital rights that I'm aiming to introduce here? Is it a tongue-in-cheek name for a bug Signal quietly patched and whose remediation, revealed here, teaches lessons useful to this crowd? Because those would make sense, right? Those are facts. Well, so are love, shame, desire, and intimacy. And my contention is that by taking these seriously and folding them into our analysis, we can better formulate a useful and liberatory understanding of privacy that helps us reach more meaningful positions and paths forward in the context of an increasingly centralized and monopolistic tech industry. For close to 2 decades, I've researched, built, and advocated for privacy and rights in the context of this metastatic tech industry. And many of you have done this for much longer than that, and you know who you are, and you've taught me a great deal, and many of you have been my inspiration in this work, so thank you for that. Now, during this time, the tech landscape has changed drastically, even as the positions that I and others, you in this room, have taken have been broadly correct, borne out, proven in hindsight time and time again. Privacy is a human right. The architectures of tech are eroding it, not protecting it. And there are many things that could be done to correct this bad trajectory, things that those in this room have laid out in painstaking detail, laboring, it would appear, under the assumption that what we're working to correct is a big misunderstanding, and that good information, refuting bad ideas, will compel those steering the direction of our collective tech to set better, more rights-preserving paths. But of course, over this same period, we've all felt the ground crumbling. We are far less private than we've ever been. And it's this reality, the reality that we're losing, that led me to dig into these key definitions. Or to paraphrase the great historian David Rodiger, by way of philosopher Amya Srinivasan, I'm not sure if speaking truth to power right now does much. But I do know that it is imperative that we speak truthfully to each other, that we clarify our terms and our maps. This is the only way we can chart a path to winning. Because failing to clarify our terms and our goals has consequences. As I argued in January 2024 in a keynote at the NDSS Symposium, we lost the crypto wars, even though many still claim we have won. Now, this observation is not new, of course. Rob Gongrip and Frank Rieger reached a similar conclusion exactly 19 years ago on this very day in this very place in a talk titled "We Lost the War." They delivered this talk a year before I graduated college and joined this strange industry. And the argument I made at NDSS in January built on Frank and Rob's work. In it, I looked at the political economic forces that shaped the tech industry we have today, alongside the analytical errors that led so many who fought on the side of encryption during the crypto wars to see the outcome as a win for privacy, even as surveillance metastasized. Now, a historical summary for those still on their learning journey. The crypto wars refer to a series of legal battles, campaigns, and policy debates that played out in the US across the 1990s, centered on questions about who should be allowed to develop and deploy strong encryption, and whether that encryption should be undermined to enable government access. Now, in decades prior, the government had asserted an effective monopoly on encryption. So much so that the academic field of cryptographic research was starved, as the NSA and others claimed the right to dominate and obscure work on crypto systems. And while this loosened somewhat in the 1970s, the government's desire to control the output of this research continued to put significant roadblocks in the way of wide dissemination. Now, moving into the 1990s, crypto systems were still classified as munitions and subject to strict export controls. And in order to integrate them into products or services and distribute them broadly, you needed government permission. Now, this regime of secrecy and restriction ended more or less with the liberalization of strong encryption at the end of the 90s, the end of the crypto wars. And it was the drive to commercialize the internet during the 90s that animated this fight. The prospect of a commercial internet provided the guarantee for monumental promises of economic prosperity that the US government and industry were counting on. It was also the forcing function for a showdown that pitted government access to communications awkwardly against the possibility of security and privacy on the commercial internet. The question was whether there should be a backdoor in encryption so governments could access internet communications and other data. No, there should not be backdoors, privacy advocates and the burgeoning tech industry said. Encryption, as strong as you want it to be, should be free to build and deploy for everyone. Many in government disagreed, but after some fractious battles and clever lawfare, in 1999, encryption was liberalized. The restrictions on its development, use, and distribution were lifted in a move celebrated again as a win for privacy. And this narrative of winning continues to shape our strategies and tactics in the fight for digital rights, somewhat to our peril. Because what I argued in my talk was that this liberalization of encryption in the 90s was, in fact, a loss for privacy. Because while it meant that theoretically everyone could build and use encryption, the same way everyone can walk away from an employment contract, in truth, due to how the growing internet industry was being shaped, it was companies who would ultimately be able to make the choice as to whether, how, and where to use encryption, not the people who needed privacy, the so-called users of these companies' platforms and services. And not only this, in the absence of any restrictions on surveillance, and given the Clinton administration's explicit endorsement of advertising as the business model of tech, tech companies were actively disincentivized to protect people's privacy. Of course, this didn't mean these companies didn't need encryption. Indeed, encryption is the backbone of the commercial internet because companies needed to protect the privacy of the stuff that helped them do business. Payments, market trades, transmission of confidential information, authentication, all of these required encryption, without which business and the process of internet commercialization would fizzle. But collecting data to create models that classify people into advertising-friendly categories that can be auctioned to agencies who create the content we see in targeted ads, which remain the core economic engine of the internet, well, applying encryption there in the name of people's privacy was not only not necessary from a financial perspective, it was bad for business. And this, my friends, is how liberalizing encryption and winning the crypto wars did not protect our privacy. What it did, in practice, is enable the growth of the surveillance advertising-driven internet with the economies of scale and network effects that have congealed into staggering concentrated power in the hands of a few dominant US and Chinese players. But before you go tooting on Mastodon, I want to be clear. This does not mean, of course, that we don't need encryption. That is not what I'm saying. This doesn't mean that encryption isn't essential to protecting privacy. Indeed, encryption is the technology we have that can do this in the digital world. We need it. It is essential, which is why Signal is so unmovably staunch in our unwillingness to ever fuck with our encryption, and will absolutely leave any market where the choice were between fucking with it and exiting. But returning to the point, we cannot mistake encryption in a vacuum for meaningful privacy, as we did in the 1990s. Confusing the technology and its capabilities, its potential application, its hypothetical use for a guarantee that it would be applied in good and just ways to create the world we wanted. Now, what I hope this recap shows is that failing to clarify our terms and what we're actually fighting for does come with grave consequences. And that part of the problem is that we pursued an incomplete and shallow definition of privacy. A definition shaped by frameworks of property rights and individual, not collective, understanding of data and data ownership. A definition that focused on bean counting data flows, where is data stored and who can access it. And one that, as we've seen, was anchored in a technologically deterministic perspective that assumed that the existence of a technology guaranteed its use, that technology birthed the future, as long as messy politics stepped out of the way. Now, this definition of privacy is, by and large, still with us today. And it's not only incomplete, it's also boring, administrative, sterile. No wonder it hasn't catalyzed a mass movement. No wonder it's so hard to get regular people excited about protecting privacy, no? And I think this is also in part because this definition is oddly silent about the good stuff, about the relationships, political horizons, intimacies, revolutions, germination, the beautiful and hopeful things in life that aren't themselves privacy, but that require privacy as a condition of their existence. The things that we fight for privacy to protect. So this is why I'm talking about emotions. Because when we move to examine privacy beyond the sphere of digital rights and tech, beyond this narrow definition, we begin to see the concept of privacy haunted, or maybe kindly accompanied by love, intimacy, and desire, which ride alongside privacy in jurisprudence, philosophy, and literature. So let's get into these. Part 2, love, intimacy, desire, and privacy. Now, anxiety about love and intimacy shapes our understanding of privacy, silently or no. As philosopher Julie Innes puts it, privacy in practice means we have the ability to, quote, control intimate decisions and to possess autonomy with respect to expressions of love, liking, and care. And indeed, when we examine how privacy is applied and revoked in the real world, it's often based on determinations about who is allowed to love, hook up, express desire, mingle in private, outside the gaze of the state, the school, or the institutions. Privacy, in this sense, marks a boundary between sanctioned love and desire, on the one hand, and unruly desires that are seen as deviant and understood to necessitate surveillance scrutiny in service of control and prevention, on the other. Who can be trusted in the shadows, and whose shadowy behavior poses a risk? Now, I'm not making a grand theoretical point here. I'm merely saying that privacy, who gets it and whom we strip it from, is very often shaped by these anxieties. Today, too. To scrape a few somber examples off the top of a massive pile, in Uganda, queer love is outlawed, punishable by death thanks to oppressive laws pushed by US evangelicals. This is why human rights groups in the UK, working to secure asylum for queer people in Uganda, rely on Signal and other private communications tools to share documents whose secrecy is a life or death matter in a context where queer people are not afforded the right to autonomy with respect to the expression of love, liking, and care, or privacy. Now in Egypt, where queer love and desire is criminalized as debauchery, Grindr stings, where authorities pose as a guy wanting to hook up on a dating app to lure queer people to be assaulted, arrested, and exposed, were apparently common enough that it prompted Grindr to issue a warning to Egyptian users, letting them know that the privacy of their desire was being systematically violated by the state, and, let's be honest, via the surveillance capabilities of the Grindr app. And then there's the current Speaker of the US House, Mike Johnson. Some months ago, he told the public that he and his son install surveillance software that monitors and reports on whether either of them have accessed porn. It's a US thing. I'm proud to tell you, my son has a clean slate, Johnson boasted. The desire to watch some porn in this case, he implies, is something both he and his son share. And for Johnson, preventing himself and his son from acting on this desire requires mutually assured shame via surveillance, or cannot be left to privacy. This present, of course, builds on a long history. In the US, interracial love was historically outlawed, same with gay love. Neither were granted the right to privacy, both were criminalized and subject to surveillance and vigilante terror. And I could go on, but I think I've sketched my point. That our understanding and application of privacy has been shaped in part by a view that some types of people have the right to practice love, intimacy, and desire, and other types do not, and thus only the former can be trusted with the right to privacy. Now with this, we've established that there's a firm connection between love, intimacy, desire, and privacy. That this isn't just an analytical exercise, although it is that. That our understanding of privacy is bound up with anxiety about love and desire, with a project that works to stifle and dam up some love and desire while permitting its flow along prescribed channels, which the selective application of privacy rights participates in enforcing. We could, of course, write this off as puritanical overreach, which it often is. But what if we also asked whether there's a deeper reason for policing love and desire? In part by establishing unevenly distributed rights to privacy. What do love and desire left unchecked do in the world? What do they threaten? What if, following Deleuze and Guattari, we were to take love and desire seriously as productive forces, and in so doing take seriously the state's need to channel and police them? So let's follow this thread. Proust wrote that, quote, "Love is a striking example of how little reality means to us." And if you've ever fallen hard in love, which I hope that you have, you know what he means. It fucks up your life. It makes a joke out of the most solemnly made plans and commitments. It threatens stability, starting with your inner life, your attachments, your literal thoughts. Someone who in February seemed nice and friendly and unremarkable suddenly upends the ground under you in March, and you cannot figure out why. Even if knowing why would help anything, which it wouldn't. You're sucking on ice cubes, you're running laps at midnight, you're in the group chat, poring over cues like a psychic reading cards. Now, this isn't the only kind of love. There are many kinds of intimacy and desire, well beyond hot crushes and romantic and sexual relationships. Love also binds solidarities, as Astra Taylor and Leah Hunt Hendricks examined in their recent work on the history and practice of solidarity. Now, solidarity, as they present it, is an ethic of care that works not in service of uniformity. We aren't in solidarity because we're the same, but in service of appreciating each other across differences and particularities, differences that are experienced and expressed in relationship, not prescribed by an institution or norm, not your job title, but who you are as a person. Solidarity makes us brave. It makes us capable of creating new worlds because we have each other's back, because it's rooted, ultimately, in love. Now, any serious scholar looking at love also acknowledges that it's not all good. For example, Sarah Ahmed examines how love can be invoked to bind coalitions in ways that are used to justify cruelty and violence to those unloved, those deemed outside the walls of the loving coalition, outside of, for example, the we that loves the nation. We'll come back to this. But for now, what we see strewn across these examples is the reality that love is, as Lauren Berlant put it, quote, a mess-making force. Love, intimacy, and desire descend on life. They threaten to upend the order of the world, whether established relationships or the primacy of the workplace hierarchy, whatever it is. Now, for Deleuze and Guattari, desire is revolutionary. Quote, desire does not want revolution. It is revolutionary in its own right, as though involuntarily, by wanting what it wants, end quote. Wanting what it wants in spite of the reality that love cares so little about. For theorist Michael Hart, this makes love the motor of transformation. It both propels transformation, wanting what it wants with no regard for order or what might stand in the way, and it helps us weather what Lauren Berlant refers to as the, quote, without guarantees part of love's various temporalities. Love, as she puts it, is one of the few situations where we desire to have patience with what isn't working. It lights our spirits up with courage to face the unknown and bear the journey in the name of the beloved, in the name of the adored ideal, in the name of loving accountability. Even though there is no way to know whether it will work, love is always a risk, said Hart. It's a risk in which we abandon some of our attachment to this world in the hope of creating a better one. Or, as Berlant puts it, it is a leap of faith to seek the end of a world on behalf of a fantasy. And it's exactly this leap of faith that love demands of us, that love requires to be loved. So now maybe we're getting somewhere, right? Because it's when we understand love, desire, intimacy as a force for transformation that we see more clearly why love, desire, and intimacy are met with anxiety and regimes of control that aim to curtail and contain exactly this transformative potential. Because, to indulge in tautology in service of making a point, transformation is of course a threat to the status quo. It's messy, uncertain, no guarantees, and whatever else it is, or it says no to what exists already. It threatens the orders and hegemonies that rely on the perseverance of current forms for their legitimacy. So we'll leave this here for now and return to it in a minute when we endeavor to weave this analysis into a more robust understanding of privacy, one that can serve as a tool that I hope will help us better make sense of our current tech landscape and identify levers for meaningful transformation. Part 3, computation, knowledge, and the politics of intellectual shame. My engagement with the concept of intellectual shame did not start as a philosophical inquiry. It began as an attempt to name a thing I experienced. In uttering the phrase, the politics of intellectual shame, I was fumbling to put language around a pattern in the environments around me, something that I saw shaping tech and our understanding of it. And maybe you've seen it too, a particular kind of fear and brittleness when technical topics are raised. Femmes in the audience are likely familiar with how some dudes seem to blow a fuse when they realize that you know more than them about something to do with computers. Even if it's simply because you read a book and they did not. And powerful people are often especially cagey around these topics when they don't have a claim to technical expertise. Now, sometimes you'll see tech ignorance accompanied by a wincing apology, the kind people make when they're hoping to be forgiven for something embarrassing. But just as often, it leads to faking it, nodding and grinning to hide uncertainty, hoping to be mistaken for knowing. The number of times I've seen a well-heeled and powerful guy nod along to an AI pitch, then repeat it as if it were gospel, even though it's not correct, even though I know he doesn't know. This is the 5th industrial revolution. No, it's the 6th, and on and on and on. This pattern, and my own experience as someone learning as I worked from within the tech industry, led me to look more closely at what was going on here and to hone in on computation's role in the world. Now, when I pulled this weed, so to speak, I found a massive root system which linked to a long history that connects state census projects, regimes of quantification and taxation, plantation accounting, workplace surveillance and rationalization, and a host of similar modes of abstraction that ultimately serve to order the world into a controllable shape for the benefit of centralized power, whether states or corporations or a secret third thing. Now, I won't recount these histories, but again, I will publish this talk with a bibliography in the future, and I encourage you to mine it and explore for yourself. There's a lot there. Because threaded through these histories is an article of faith that assumes abstract, fungible representations of the world are the proper way to know it, and that the particular, the specific, the exceptional, and the sensory are unreliable and cannot be counted on as knowledge. That the proper vantage for knowledge is from the top, behind the curtain, out of harm's way, through the window of the corner office looking down. And that certain people are capable of such knowledge, and certain others can only be the subjects of it. And it's here where we catch the authoritarian edge. In an introduction to Klaus Thuelit's, sorry, I haven't said that out loud much. In an introduction to Klaus Thuelit's examination of the diaries and literature of Hitler's shock troops, the Free Corps, scholar Barbara Ehrenreich puts this domination by knowledge in stark terms. The authoritarian attitude, as demonstrated in the Free Corps literature, amounted to, quote, "We know and are therefore human. They, fumbling in darkness after what they do not know, can only be objects of our knowledge, hence not fully human." Now, to put this in modern parlance, you're either a main character or a non-playable character, and only one matters. Today, tech holds this place at the epistemic apex. It is the way to know us and our world, turning everything else into objects of tech's knowledge. So, to know tech, to control tech, is to be a main character, or at least to claim to be on the side of those who are winning, those who know, not those who are known. And so, the desire to claim expertise, even when we don't have it in the context of tech, does make sense. Now, in using the term tech, I'm referring primarily to the products, services, and infrastructures that have deposited themselves across our world via the current tech industry and its broken incentives. Tech here is a contingent formation shaped by the economic drivers that were enshrined during the struggle for internet commercialization in the 1990s and beyond, and that set the course for vast centralization and surveillance power. Now, this isn't what tech or computation inevitably is. It's not the essence. But it's what we generally mean when we invoke it. And it's important to keep the contingent nature of tech as it is in view. It doesn't have to be this way. But advocating for change in tech is hard, in part because leveraging Cold War-era narratives of science and progress, the current tech industry, its stenographers, and most regular people whose ignorance of computation makes them particularly prone to taking industry's word for it, have conflated commercial tech products and services, what tech is now, with human and scientific progress. To regulate, to question, to perturb the tech status quo is thus figured as interfering with the arc of this progress. And by narrating the decisions that tech companies make in the name of profit and growth as the products of innovation and progress, advertising data becomes ground truth for intelligence. Surveillance becomes collective knowledge. Social control becomes an intelligent prediction, meted out by a sultry-voiced AI assistant that never turns off. So from this perspective, encouraging a culture that shames question asking and promotes the idea that not knowing about computers makes you dumb and subservient makes a lot more sense, especially given the way capital flows in the current tech industry, where you make money in tech not when tech works, although it may, but when it's assumed to work, when it's seen as capable and robust enough to result in an IPO or an acquisition. Investors need to believe your pitch. If 90% of them are nodding along to the guy nodding along in time with the guy in the Patagonia vest who's also nodding without really knowing, that is fine. You all win. Whoever loses down the road. And if you're all invested already, well, then you have a stake in silence as well. Because you all lose if the guy asking dumb questions ends up revealing a foundational flaw in your hype before you're able to cash out. A culture that shames ignorance also, of course, shames learning, shames the practice of asking the questions that produce understanding and new and better questions and new worlds. And it's here that I'm going to link it back with love. Ignorance, not knowing, is the starting position of learning. It's a vulnerable position, and one that propels transformation and all the uncertainty and danger that transformation entails. To pick up that textbook, I need to recognize that there is something it has that I don't, that I'd like to incorporate into my relationship to reality. I need to acknowledge my ignorance. to recognize that I'd like to be changed by what's in that book, without yet knowing how that change will affect the web of knowledge and relationships that constitute my consciousness before I read. To admit ignorance and to ask the questions and pursue their answers requires a willingness to be changed by knowledge, to have your map filled in, rearranged, your mind palace reshuffled. You are consenting to have your relationship with the world transformed, and like all transformations, it's no guarantees, it's messy. Sound familiar? Learning, like love, is an engine of transformation. Love and desire break down boundaries, transform relationships, and open up possibilities for new freedoms. Berlant's mess-making force. Learning and pedagogy, too, are mess-making forces. Taking what's understood, the dominant paradigm, the classifications handed down from the window in the corner office, the geocentric model of the universe, for example, and threatening to dismantle these and everything that rests on their being true. And in this way, learning, the acknowledgement of not knowing and the willingness to face the uncertainty and transformation that learning requires, is also dangerous, in a similar way to love, intimacy, and desire. And this helps us understand the particular culture of intellectual shame in tech. Part 4. Epistemic authority, or defining privacy beyond data. A rehydrated understanding of privacy needs to take these lessons seriously. To take seriously the role of love, intimacy, desire, and learning in forming new worlds that rudely and wonderfully reject established orders. And to figure privacy as the necessary condition that enables and protects these. But to do this, our understanding of privacy needs to go beyond data. It must confront epistemic authority head-on, confronting the forces that claim the right to define our world on behalf of the rest of us, who are figured as objects of this knowledge, not producers of it. It's here where the dry data-centric privacy paradigms common in tech fail us most drastically. Because once the data is created, the question of who gets to define me has already been answered. No, I don't want to own my Facebook data. I want to disavow Facebook as an arbiter, to reject Facebook's right to any claim to know me and my people and the type of person I am to begin with. Yes. I want to retain the right to fall in love drastically, to change my mind wildly based on new knowledge that scrambles paradigms and common sense, and to forge and sever relationships and move toward messy, no guarantees transformation, toward truly new understandings and communities. I want this for all of us. But without a focus on epistemic authority, even privacy arguments against creating and collecting data can end up reaffirming the power of tech to define us, especially when they argue that data limitation is necessary due to such data's accuracy or sensitivity. Because this argument ultimately implies that data is a proper and accurate way to know us to begin with, but that such knowledge should not be in the hands of one or another party. By taking data as a given, and contesting only who has the right to it, we naturalize and affirm the companies and institutions that create it. We naturalize them as rightful arbiters of us and our world. But when exactly did we give a few companies the right to define who we are with more authority than we have, right? So a meaningful definition of privacy needs to start before data. It needs to incorporate a much more fundamental understanding of the right to privacy as the right to define ourselves in our own terms, to practice and experiment with the mess-making forces of love, intimacy, desire, and knowledge-making, and a right to the unobserved epistemic space in which to do this. I agree. This is a space where we can make our own knowing about ourselves and each other through practices of learning that reject the politics of intellectual shame, the idea that ignorance is humiliating and best hidden, and instead admit the messy vulnerability of ignorance and misunderstanding as exhilarating starting places from which we can proceed to shape our own knowledge, knowledge of ourselves, of each other, and of our world that engages deep questioning and critique, not to tear down, but to temper and strengthen. Practices of knowledge-making that reject the status of objects of text knowing as a first-order concern. Now, before I move on, I want to touch back on the negative edge of love, the love of nation, to take Ahmed's example, that works to justify cruelty and exclusion against those deemed outside the loving community. What we see here, I believe, is the dangerous tendency to reproduce epistemic domination even from within our cocooned, private, loving communities, to dissolve the classifications and boundaries between us in transformative ways, even as we reapply them to others seen as objects of our knowing. Now, this is a tendency we need to reject, as we reject epistemic domination in total, not simply when it's applied to us. Fighting for encryption during the crypto wars in the 1990s was necessary, of course, but because it didn't clarify the outcome we were fighting for, practically speaking, it ended up resulting in a setback for privacy and the tech industry we see today. Similarly, fighting for more restricted data flows, for data ownership and limitations, and more robust click wrap, without looking at who's behind the curtain creating the data that's structuring our world and our place in it to begin with, serves to strengthen tech's hold on us and to reaffirm tech's place as the organizing principle of our world. A definition of privacy focused on rejecting tech's epistemic authority is a good place to begin correcting this. Part 5. Conclusion. Practical applications. Love, privacy, and homomorphic encryption. So, what do we do with this love-centric reformulation of privacy? What does it mean to reject the epistemic authority of a massively powerful industry in the name of privacy that protects transformation and rejects being objects of their knowing? Like, what does it mean at a practical level? Well, the good news is that, on a practical level, it is both energizing and clarifying. We can take, for example, homomorphic encryption, which is being applied hither and thither by large tech companies for things like so-called sovereign cloud offerings and on-device AI models. In these cases, some pretty impressive zero-knowledge work is providing the technical substance behind massive marketing campaigns touting the privacy-preserving properties of these products and services. Homomorphic encryption guarantees privacy, the claims go, because data processing happens on your device, not on Apple's or Google's servers, because data is never sent off your device, and because of the presence of technically guaranteed plausible or provable deniability. But, butterfly meme, is this privacy? Now, under the old data-centric understanding, yeah, sort of, probably. It's not worth joining a movement over, but I guess it's privacy. It leverages encryption, after all, and isn't that private? But with a version of privacy that is animated by a rejection of epistemic authority, by the protection of spaces for love, transformation, and radical reimagining that cannot accept such imposed classifications, the answer to the question of whether this is privacy changes. And, as I promised, it gets a lot clearer. No, it's not private. It may be better than the alternative in some way or another. There may be reasons that it represents harm reduction over the status quo, and that's a tactical call. But again, no, it's not private. Under this rehydrated privacy definition, it doesn't matter so much where the data is processed if the AI models, the logics and the probabilities by which it classifies me and my activity remain firmly outside of my control. Whether or not the model is on device, it's nevertheless imposing classifications and categories solely determined by Apple or Google or whoever. Categories that work to slot me into one or another cell in a metaphorical and literal database, and that go on to produce more classifications and judgments about me, even as the companies producing these claim plausible deniability when it comes to what specifically these classifications mean and their potential errors. Now, what we do from here is a question of strategy and our position and leverage. It will be answered differently by different people, as well it should be. But I believe a love-centric definition of privacy that starts before data and that rejects, again, our status as objects of text knowing actually helps clarify this landscape and clarify a path forward. And I think it's much more fun. It's much cooler. It centers the lives and loves we want, the things that make life worthwhile, and why privacy matters for these. This gives us something worth fighting for, and in doing so, it calls all the wonderful, beautiful people who also want the world's privacy must exist to protect, but don't want to have boring conversations about data protection. So this, then, is why I'm talking about love at a hacker conference. Thank you.